Thanks again for having me and everybody else on the panel. I'm Colin Griffin. I founded Crumware. We're an 8-year long running startup, but we're applications developers who specialize in platform engineering.
Over to you, Lorna.
Perfect. Hello, I'm Lorna. I'm VP Developer Experience at Redocly. We do APIs and documentation tooling. I've had a career mostly in software development, and it's really all been about APIs. I wrote an O'Reilly book about web services way back in the day, and I've been building and integrating APIs all that time. I'm a contributor to OpenAPI. Would describe myself as an API enthusiast.
Wonderful. Over to you.
Hey everyone, this is Amod. I'm head of product at Traceable. We are an API security company. Prior to joining Traceable, I was at AppDynamics, which was an application performance monitoring company. So this topic is very close to my heart. It's a perfect confluence of API and observability, which is what I've been doing for the past 10 years. But really passionate about this area and looking forward to a great discussion here.
Brilliant. The reason why we put this together again was we were again thinking about where API observability sits in the overall spectrum of platform stacks and development stacks that you're building together. So we thought we'll bring together folks from different walks of life, whether you're working in the platform engineering space, whether you're working in the application development space from the end-to-end design perspective, or you're working, like Amod mentions, around the intersection almost of API security and observability brought together. Again, a huge consideration when it comes to architecting those solutions. So we'll kick things off really quickly to just sort of underline and highlight sort of the importance of why we are here, sort of the importance of observability in API platforms. Our session is all about designing observable API platforms. So let's kick off about the importance of that. So maybe Colin, you could kick us off with the importance of observability in API platforms. What does that look like? What is that true value that observability drives for API platform teams?
100%. To take a step back too, it's interesting to me when we look at the development lifecycle and how developers are interacting with applications. And if we think about platform engineering as a practice and understanding the end users being the developers, the data teams, the operators, everybody else who needs this information is going to interact with some form of the application management. API observability, I think, is a thing that takes a back seat sometimes, or folks don't necessarily understand how to implement that out of the gate. And development teams run into all sorts of problems when, especially when there's not an expectation of what people are responsible for necessarily. Like, how does a developer actually get actionable information about how an API is operating? Is it something, whether it's from the security side, whether it's from the performance side, or just in general, are things going well, is always an interesting thing. But there's this overlap between how does observability and monitoring look at the development portion of the life cycle versus the in production form of the life cycle as well. And it's absolutely critical that we treat observability as a first-class citizen and get that out there in the development stacks and educate the developers as far as how they can develop these applications to take advantage of the existing tools that exist in the platform. And I think that too many development teams just don't feel equipped for that and don't know what observability means and don't know the benefits of that. And because they can't communicate that, it makes it challenging to get the implementation somewhere to actually get those tools in place. I don't know. I hope that doesn't deviate too much from the question, but I do think observability should be a first-class citizen. Maybe Lorna, I think.
100%.
Yeah,
I 100% agree with that. I think I'll get to Lorna really in a little bit. I think I just want to ask you if you had to articulate that value, because I think we were just in a discussion with Adriana before about how organizations adopt open telemetry, and it sort of needs that champion to drive that discussion around value. So if you had to articulate sort of that primary value, maybe from the lens of an API platform team or even a lens of a business, what would you say that would be? Sort of an elevator pitch for observability adoption. What would that look like?
Time savings. Oh man, time savings. We go into organizations all the time. There's multiple we're talking to right now, and from the business leader standpoint, maybe they've said, "Oh, this consolidated platform to bring all of these logs and metrics and everything together, it costs too much money." right? And they're saying it costs too much money. It might be $400, right? And we take a step back and we say, okay, so you have 150 different workloads running in production right now, and this is a small environment compared to what we've seen in some cases. And your developers are being required to bounce from workload to workload to workload to workload to figure out what's going wrong and where, and they have no idea. And that's taking them a week to find one problem when it could take them a matter of minutes if you had the right patterns in place. The time savings, the support for the developers and their happiness and their ability to focus on the right things at the right time, there's huge implications that can ripple if we don't have observability patterns in place.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Lorna, coming to you after this, I think, again, speaking about that value of observability at the level that you're operating from the application design and development side of things, where does that value come into the conversation? What do you see that true value of that coming in?
I think the key thing here with observability when we talk about APIs is, I mean, I feel like Colin stole a lot of the punchlines there, that we need to take it seriously and find the right level of observability for the different parts of the application stack that we're working in and looking at what's appropriate. The API is often the edge. Like, this is where your traces are, it's the entry exit point for the traces. If you're under any kind of attack, it's where you're going to have the metrics that tell you there's a problem. So, you know, yes, I agree that we have an education issue, but I think we need to show what does the first level of pattern look like, because we get that value back. You don't need to make a huge investment. You need to do the first right thing. And the APIs, which also need some education and also need to be first-class citizens, and that is maybe a whole separate conference talk, they need that observability in them so that you can always get the value of the APIs that you build, because you've got that resilience and that reliability in those often outside-facing parts of your application.
Great, thank you so much. So far, we've been talking about sort of the value of doing things right. I mean, Amod, I'm going to come to you to ask about what happens if you don't do this. What is sort of the flip side of that? What does bad look like in this context?
Yeah.
Maybe there's a security conversation here where you have not thought about it, and where that intersection comes in, perhaps.
Yeah, there is bad when you have too much data, too much observability data, and you don't know how to sift through it. You don't know how to organize it. And there's bad when you have no observability data. There are two types of bad here. If you have no observability data, you're flying blind. And if you're a platform team that's got a distributed platform, which is running across availability zones, across data centers, and something somewhere goes wrong, you're going to spend hours, if not days, in a war room with the platform engineering team and the DevOps team trying to figure out which link in the chain failed you. If you have all the data in the world that you need, but you don't have it organized, you're going to get alert fatigue. You're going to get alerted because CPU in some random machine spiked up, even though you have load balancing and automatic scaling turned on. It's going to take care of itself. So it's very important in, at least in our experience, I think it's table stakes to have observability data. That's why open source movements such as OpenTelemetry, CNCF-driven movements have become successful. And it's now almost a given that these type of things will be there. But it's also very important to think about how you're going to use that data. Are you going to get alerted for every single metric that you're ingesting from your platform? Or will you have some outcome-driven KPIs that are driving the alerts, and when those alerts fire, you use those to drill down into the components that may have caused that outcome to deviate from baseline. So to give you an example, we used to have a customer that was a movie tickets platform, and they were using our observability tool to figure out if the application, and those applications weren't so distributed back in the day. APIs weren't that much of a concept. People used to think about application monitoring and observability around applications. But they had this problem that there was too many alerts coming out for CPU, for memory utilization, for garbage collection, for all of these things. So what they ended up doing was they ended up creating top-level alerts for number of tickets sold. And those metrics were baselined by day, by hours. So weekends look different from Monday mornings when tickets are being sold. And once those metrics baselined and when those alerts got fired, they knew immediately that there was a business problem that they need to tackle and go in. So very, very high level and very 10,000 feet example of what I meant by outcome-driven metrics. But going back to your question, there's both sides. You're in a bad situation, you have nothing, and you're also in a bad situation, you have too much of everything.
Great. That segues very nicely into, okay, now we've got the good and we've got the bad. Now we are starting to design our solution overall, the observable platforms, keeping in mind sort of the different stakeholders. I think in this case, you've got your platform teams, you've got your application development teams, and then you've got the business stakeholders as well. You're looking at the true value for end users. So Lorna, I'm going to come to you first with sort of the design question around what are those initial design considerations that you think on when you're starting off, and then how could that potentially evolve, and how do you factor that in? So let's start with almost like a first day sort of a metric that you need to think about from a design perspective, and then take it forward from there.
What I really like to do here is to think about the destination. So what are we shipping? What kind of API is it? What's going to be appropriate here in terms of governance, standards, security? What does the production environment look like? Like, what are we making? Is it the newsletter side of API, or is it financial transactions? Like, those are two different things, and you're gonna do this differently. So I think I spoiled in my intro, I'm an OpenAPI standard contributor. Like, please use OpenAPI format, because this is the way that you are going to communicate precisely and thoroughly across your teams, your tools, every stage of the life cycle, all the way from design through to the gateways. And you're going to use your OpenAPI with things we haven't invented yet. That's been my takeaway. Is I once wrote OpenAPI descriptions because I thought it would make better documentation, and that has delivered hundreds of times over as the tools in that space has evolved, and APIs, as we know, is a very exciting space, so there's a lot happening. The other thing that I see go wrong really at the beginning is just not taking the whole thing seriously enough, not getting your tool chain to the point where different teams control different parts of the API surface, and you're combining those as appropriate, or not shipping just the public endpoints to the API gateway so that they're not even there, never mind not secured. It's a defense in-depth thing. So I see a lot of, here is the code, we have generated the API description, we have used it. And people are not maneuvering those pieces of OpenAPI. They're not using the tools to combine things, to filter out those not really implemented yet endpoints, or whatever it is that makes sense in your application. So just like what we already said about observability being, it's gaining maturity. I feel that there's a lot of organizations that are not yet getting past that sort of 101. They don't have good linting, or they're using recommended rules. So they haven't added something that they know is important in this API, in this organization. And so you end up with something that's just a bit of a compromise. And never ever ship your first API without the security that we will eventually have. Don't think you're going to fit it later, fit it now.
I am 100% certain Amod has something to say about that. But just going on the point of open standards, I think at Tyke, I think anyone who knows Tyke or anyone who knows me, I've got very strong opinions around things like standardization and governance, and having those guardrails and rules, which again, to some, it means that you're limiting and restricting them in some way. But to me, that is foundational. If you have strong, predictable foundations of how you're building platforms, you can innovate much faster. You can go a lot quicker. Developers have that faith that the system's not going to break down every time they try something out for the very first time. At Tyke, we're an open source gateway. We look at OpenTelemetry. We are OpenTelemetry native, OAS native. We support for open policy agents. So for us, open standards are essentially that language that communicates and connects across these different almost extended integrated platform stacks that we are building today. It's never a standalone system. It always needs to communicate with either other observability platforms or security solutions, identity providers. There's a whole range of things that are better suited to solve specific dedicated problems, and you want to be able to communicate with that instead of having to either try and integrate that on a proprietary level. It again leads to that vendor lock-in situation, which you definitely want to avoid. That costs a lot of money not only to get in, but also to get out. So it's a whole range of mess. So huge believer are open standards. For our case, obviously, open telemetry is the big one. OAS is another big one. So I'm gonna go back maybe to Amod before I go on to Colin. Again, I'm very certain thinking about API security upfront as early as possible, very, very important. But to what extent, how much can you predict sort of your future requirements? To what end do you think about API security upfront? And how do you cater for evolving and changing needs in the security space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I'll go back to a point that Lorna made earlier in her comment that APIs are really the gates of these distributed services that are communicating with each other. In the old world, you used to have a network pipe through which all the traffic was coming in. And if you put a firewall on that network pipe, you were reasonably secure that you were watching, if not preventing bad traffic from coming in. In this cloud world, in this distributed world, you don't have a pipe. It's the internet. So now the security has moved on from securing that network pipe to the gates from which these communication happens. Now, what does it mean to secure those gates? That is an end-to-end journey. So you have security that, again, I think like Lorna was saying, that starts when you are thinking about developing these APIs, right? From your open API specifications, writing them down, doing code scanning, doing active testing to simulate bad actors and malicious codes. Then from that point on, you have passive detections by looking at the traffic, and that's where open telemetry and that observability traffic really helps. Actually, traceable, the name traceable comes from the fact that we rely on traces to do a lot of security and API event detection. So when these traces come in, we look at those traces to try and understand if there was malicious traffic that was coming in as part of those traces independently, and also if the pattern in which these traces came in within a session or over a period of day deviated from normal, and if there's an enumeration attack that's happening, if there's recon that's happening, and an attacker is trying to probe for weaknesses, we can see in those sessions which are populated by traces. So security and observability are very tightly coupled. One, traditionally people think about observability to be performance monitoring, but it's not that. We did that at AppDynamics, and we realized that there is a lot of rich data that we get from telemetry and traces. If we don't focus just on performance, start to look at other aspects such as security, obviously, and also business performance monitoring, you can derive a lot of value from those. And that's kind of what we're doing at Traceable. We are relying on traces and open telemetry. Our way of data collection is 100% compatible with the open standards. In fact, Traceable generates open API specs from reverse engineering the traffic that's coming in. In a lot of customers, we find that they've acquired products, especially large enterprises or developers that have written that product have moved on, and the documentation isn't where it's supposed to be. So one of the first things that Traceable does is it starts to discover all these APIs based on telemetry traffic. And then again, based on telemetry traffic, generates open API specs for each of these APIs, creates a risk profile around each of these APIs based on, are they authenticated? Are they being accessed over a secure protocol? Are they responding back with sensitive data? Are they being accessed externally? There's a whole bunch of dimensions that we look at to come to all of that. But it starts with observability. It starts with those traces.
Thank you so much for that, Amod. I'm going to head over to Colin before we open things up for Q&A. Sorry, Colin. In terms of, obviously, we've spoken a little bit about some of the key considerations from the design perspective. What would you say, some key challenge in terms of building these observable API platform could be? And then how do you potentially cater for that? What is if there is one thing that folks need to absolutely implement or think about when they are building out observable API platforms, what would you say that one thing that they absolutely must do straight away?
Yeah, one interesting concept to consider for is like in this cloud native world, right, where a lot of folks are using Kubernetes now and everything there. One of the big benefits of cloud native is being able to run someone else's applications and someone else's tools. And I mean, we're putting together different black boxes and building at more expansive applications by collecting and consuming and delivering and providing, right, somebody else's tools, not necessarily the observability tools, but somebody's APIs, right? Somebody's front ends, any number of things there. And if we don't follow proper patterns to enable the teams that are running and operating our tools, honestly, it applies back to our own internal teams as well. It's not necessarily an internal maturity thing as much as it is just, this is the way things are now. We need to make sure that observability tools work with our applications, with our APIs, the things that we develop. And I mean, the easiest place to start is make sure you're logging appropriately. A lot of the migrations that we see or legacy applications, we had to engineer and design observability ourselves. We had to use special logging drivers or pipe logs directly to some centralized place. But now we have mechanisms that allow other observability tools to pick up those logs and do things for us, like do things with them for us. So just making sure that your code, your applications, your APIs, they're following proper logging patterns so that that telemetry data can get picked up and siphoned and delivered somewhere so that you don't have to worry about it and hard code that. Or the situation where somebody may log into a pod and go check and there are no logs, and so you can't see anything. Make sure you're logging to standard error and standard out, please. Just start there. And then the other observability tool should at least be able to pick that up. But then we can start to advance the conversation into tools like eBPF and some other things that enable more embedded tracing and logging along the way. But I think it just comes down to educating and developer patterns and just making the data available so that some team can take responsibility over that and provide you back with the tools you need to build that actionable intelligence.
One question I have on this, because we touched upon this in the previous session right now, because there is that risk when you're trying to log everything and anything and everything without having possibly a plan sometimes, which a lot of teams end up doing because they said, we don't know, maybe we need this in the future, so let's just log everything right now. There could be a possible cost implication of that. So how do you sort of prioritize when you're thinking about what you're logging? Is cost a potential factor to sort of prioritize exactly what you need? Does it still need to be more requirements driven straight up front, even if you don't see the full picture yet? How do you sort of make sure that you're not in a situation of sort of a logs explosion kind of a situation, Colin?
Yeah, noisy neighbor problems, all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
I don't think there's an easy answer to that one. The other guys might have a much more specific answer for me, but I'm very much in the camp of at least output the logs for as much as you can, because if you pre-filter that information, you'll never have it. And then implement logging drivers or other tools that can then filter, and maybe you can have some runtime configurability or build some things at that layer, but choose to ship and store those logs and filter what you're storing if you need to limit the amount of information that's there. But at the application layer, at the code layer, don't limit the amount of logging that you're doing. And then somebody's going to watch this and say that that's totally wrong and everything, because there's different logging levels and things there.
Yeah.
But frankly, too many teams just don't log anything because they are worried about the costs. And so I'd say work backwards into that. But if you have proper observability tools, you will be able to predict and understand the costs of your logging and monitoring as well.
That is very important. I think that what that would do obviously is that you may start off with a hypothesis, and I mean that's what you can really do on a day one situation, and then you need to have that monitoring in place to be able to optimize based and make those decisions based on what is actually working and what isn't, what is actually bringing you that true value, which is why we started off with the value conversation. Because based on the value drivers, even at the observability level, you can make those decisions a little bit further. Now, thank you so much for that, Colin. We only have 5 more minutes left, so I'm very mindful of it. There is one question that has come up from Miguel. I think, Lorna, you might be in the right position to be able to answer that. Should OAS 3 be used to describe or some degree or elements of observability Good point on OS 3 to communicate between different teams along the API lifecycle. But is OS 3 or OAS in general something that you should be using to sort of describing or designing your observability requirements as well?
Not really. Miguel's mentioning the API lifecycle SIG, so that's the special interest groups that we have within OpenAPI for standards and kind of research initiatives that are related to the specification, but things that probably won't become part of core so that everybody has to implement them all the time. And the lifecycle one's quite interesting, looking at with the different endpoints, the versioning, the deprecation, like how does that all work? In terms of observability, I would say that's not the right place to get that written down. The API, OpenAPI description is there to describe your API interface. And if you change the observability or improve your tracing, whatever, that's not part of that. So no, those are two different things. There are standards that you can use to describe some of those tracing events and stuff like that. So have a look at with OpenTelemetry. I think there's some async API stuff that fits together with that. So there are open standards, but they're not all OpenAPI, I think is the best way to talk about that.
Got it. Colin, Amod, any particular sort of recommendation on those open standards? Like I think Lorna mentioned about OS as potentially being that sort of interface at that interface level for APIs. Would you say at an observability level, is there somewhere or something that would potentially design or describe your observability requirements a little bit better? Maybe Amod first and then over to Colin.
Sure. I think like Lorna was saying, right, the telemetry data, even if you summarize it in terms of somebody else in the chat was asking what are the key KPIs. We've always thought of key KPIs as load response time and error. So if you want to start with something at the top, start with load response time and errors per API, per application, summarize it all the way. I don't think that those metrics are the right things to put in the OpenAPI spec or any standard. But at the same time, SLAs that a user that's consuming an API, what SLAs can they expect from an API? That should be documented somewhere. If I'm a developer and I'm building an API and my expectation is that this API should come back within 30 milliseconds, because the amount of data that it consumes, the amount of the number of backends it calls, and what this API is supposed to behave like, that to the person that's asking this question, that's something that's missing currently. We don't have that described anywhere. People struggle with coming up with SLAs in the first place. Most often they look at the history to determine this API has traditionally behaved this way and nothing wrong has happened. So I'll use a median, mean, 95th percentile or something like that as the SLA. But again, where do you put that? And maybe OpenAPI spec is the place to put it. Maybe there are other standards that at least I'm not aware of where we can put it. So again, not the measurement of the performance, but the standards you can expect from that API or the SLA that you can expect should be put somewhere.
Cool. I think maybe API definition could be a potential place, but again, I'm not sure if there's a true open standard. I think especially if you combine everything. But I do want to pick. I think we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'm gonna end this with I think what Rich in the chat has asked, which is what would the panel suggest are some North Star API platform metrics that potentially drive value for API platforms? Maybe we start off with Colin, sort of any particular North Star that sort of drives that API platform metrics, from something as a key takeaway from today's conversation.
I'm going to stick to my theme of start somewhere. Really, frankly, I feel like it's not commonplace enough where a lot of teams aren't ready to pick a particular set of metrics. They just need to get started. And I would just say, just start logging. Are you logging? That's weird for a North Star for something, but let's make sure that all of our APIs are producing farmable, actionable intelligence. And just, are we logging is a great place to start for that.
Great. Over to you, Lorna. Anything specific that you want to mention as a North Star design perspective or not?
I think for me, we talked a bit about the APIs being first-class products, and we need to have more experts in the API space. Amod just mentioned the response time, that's massive. like when that starts to decay, you need to sort that out, because that's a big problem for all of your integrators. And it kind of is a little problem until it's a big problem. Honestly, I build a lot of B2B APIs, and a lot of our customers are focused on that. So my metrics are product metrics. Like if your platform is not doing its job, if your customers are not growing or retaining with you, if you're seeing a lot of churn, the platform is probably part of that story.
Fantastic. Great point on the product metrics, because we're going to be exploring something like that later on in the session with folks from Mosef, which is Derek from Mosef, actually, which will be great. Amod, bring us home. Final thoughts on the North Star metric that we should be looking at. We've already been talking about it a little bit, but potential North Star metric for API platforms.
Yeah, in the case of performance monitoring, if you're going to use observability for performance monitoring, I think the North Star metrics are your external facing APIs and their load, their response time, and their error rate, which together will indicate whether it's available or not. And if it's available, is it performing better? Those three have been the most important for me. If you're talking about using API observability for security, those change a little bit. Then you're looking at a different set of tuples still derived from the telemetry data you're getting. But now you're looking at what type of attacks are happening. Is the volumetric data becomes much more important than the some of the other metrics. Response time takes somewhat of a backseat from a security point of view. But the kind of data that's coming in, is it coming over a secure protocol? Are you seeing the enumeration type patterns within that data? So analyzing it differently. On the business side, which is the third use case for observability that we've seen, it's very business centric. If you are e-commerce company, we've used customers use open telemetry data and performance monitoring data for driving their entire funnels. How many customers are coming to the page, how many of them are logging in, surfing, adding things to cart, checking out, and the entire funnel can get built. But that is very dependent on the business you're in. Back to performance. I think if you have to start somewhere, start with your external facing APIs that other teams or end users can access directly, and start to look at their load, response time, and error rate metrics, and set up some baselines around those, and then go from there.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a fantastic session. Again, 30 minutes go by very, very quickly. We can probably go on for this for at least another hour, I feel. There's so many other aspects to touch upon, and we'll explore some of those definitely in the future sessions today itself, which is going to be fantastic. But now we go into a bit of a lunch break. We are halfway through already, which has gone by, again, very, very quickly. It's lunch break. We have about 30 minutes before the next session starts. When we are back, we'll again, on the two streams, we'll start off with breaking the chain of blame through end-to-end testing with distributed tracing from trace test in the implementers track. And then we'll be opening up a panel discussion about unlocking the API ops cycle through open telemetry observability. So two amazing sessions coming up, but we've got a 30-minute break in the middle. We'll see you on the other side of it. Thank you so much, panelists. It's been an absolute pleasure. Take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.